Okay, so agreeableness is one of the 5 dimensions of the big 5. We all know that, and it can be broken down into these 2 aspects, compassion and politeness. And so you can kind of figure out how agreeable you are by looking at these items. They're all positively scored for the sake of simplicity. So if you intensely feel others' emotions, if you're always inquiring about how others are doing and you actually care rather than doing it for the sake of show, if you're capable of sympathizing with other people, if you respect authority, if you don't like to seem or be pushy and you don't like to impose your will on others, then you're an agreeable person. And a disagreeable person or an antagonistic person obviously is the opposite of that. So they don't feel people's emotions very profoundly. They're not really all that concerned automatically about how other people are feeling, and they're not that sympathetic. It's funny because in my clinical practice I can tell the difference between the agreeable people and the non-agreeable people, because when the agreeable people come and they have a cup of coffee, they always bring me one. But when the disagreeable people show up and have a cup of coffee, they only bring a cup of coffee for themselves. So it's quite comical, actually. So now you might think that, you know, because our what would you say? Our society is at the moment tilted towards regarding agreeableness as a virtue, you know, because you should be kind and you should be empathetic and you should be compassionate and all those sorts of things. But our research, this isn't published yet because it's complicated to communicate and we haven't figured out how to do it yet. But what we've found is that if you push any of the traits too far, they fall off a cliff fundamentally. So if you get too agreeable, then you're dependent and you can't make decisions and so on. And maybe you're kind of a Freudian Oedipal mother too, right? You're so concerned with your child's well-being that you're not harsh enough to send them outside or make them do anything they don't want to do because it might upset them. And so that's not so good. And then if you're too disagreeable, well, I already said what that was like. If you take antisocial people who are in prison, you know, they're aggressive and violent, and you know, the criminal types, and they're predatory, are low in agreeableness. So you can see how that's a bad thing. But then in the middle range, it gets more complicated, because then agreeableness, where you're located on the normal distribution, how good that is depends to some degree on what it is that you are going to do. So one of the ways to think about how to maximize your success in life is to attempt to match your personality to the environment. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how agreeableness plays out, as far as we can tell, in the actual world. This is, I should tell you too, this is the sort of discussion that people really don't like. Everything we're going to talk about pretty much from here on in rubs people the wrong way, because our culture is very likely to assume that most of the differences between people are cultural in origin, and almost none of the data show that. What they show is that at least as your culture becomes more egalitarian, which is hypothetically what you're aiming at, the differences, gender differences for example, not only become more biological because you've eradicated all the cultural difference, but they also become more pronounced. So for example, the gender differences between men and women are largest in the most egalitarian societies, like Norway and Sweden and so on. And so the theory there is that, well, once you've eradicated all the environmental differences, all that are left are the genetic differences. And so that's sort of echoed in a weird finding in families. So, you know, you might think that if how you raised your children mattered, then children who were raised well would be more similar than children who were raised badly, because that would reflect the effect of your parenting, right? So you've done a good job as a parent, so your children are more similar, whereas someone who just ignored them, those children are different. But that's actually the opposite of what happens, is that the children that are neglected are more similar, and the children who are attended to well are more different. And the reason for that, I think, is the same reason that we see more pronounced differences in egalitarian societies, which is, if you care for your children, it means that you make a very individual relationship with each of them. So you're not necessarily using the same strategies for each child, unless you think of them as meta-strategies. And like a meta-strategy might be, well, I get to know you, and I get to know you, and because you're different people, I react differently to you. And what constitutes my philosophy of parenting would be act differently towards the children's differences. And so maybe if you're particularly good at that, your children turn out maximally different from one another, and that's because you're allowing their genetic differences to manifest themselves. You're not oppressing them, you know, and trying to cram them into the little box that you think that they should fit in. Now the downside of that is that you're going to get differences, you know, and some of them might be quite surprising to you. So